Novel 8. The Count of Antwerp, laboring under a false accusation, goes into exile. He leaves his 2 children in different places in England and takes service in Ireland. Returning to England an unknown man, he finds his sons prosperous. He serves as a groom in the army of the King of France. His innocence is established, and he is restored to his former honors. The ladies heaved many sighs over the various fortunes of the fair lady. But what prompted those sighs, who shall say? With some, perchance, 'twas as much envy as pity of one to whose lot fell so many nights of delight. But however this may be, when Pamphilio's story was ended, and the laughter which greeted his last words had subsided, the queen turned to Alyssa and bade her follow suit with one of her stories. So Alyssa, with a cheerful courage, thus began. Vast indeed is the field that lies before us, wherein to roam at large. 'Twould readily afford each of us not 1 course but 10, so richly has fortune diversified it with episodes both strange and somber. Wherefore, selecting one such from this infinite store, I say, that, after the transference of the Roman Empire from the Franks to the Germans, the greatest enmity prevailed between the 2 nations, with warfare perpetual and relentless. Wherefore, deeming that the offensive would be their best defense, the King of France and his son mustered all the forces they could raise from their own dominions and those of their kinsmen and allies, and arrayed a grand army for the subjugation of their enemies. Before they took the field, as they could not leave the realm without a governor, they chose for that office Gaudier, Count of Antwerp, a true knight and sage counselor, and their very loyal ally and vassal, choosing him the rather, because, albeit he was a thorough master of the art of war, yet they deemed him less apt to support its hardships than for the conduct of affairs of a delicate nature. Him, therefore, they set in their place as their vicar-general and regent of the whole realm of France, and having so done, they took the field. Count Gaudier ordered his administration wisely and in a regular course, discussing all matters with the queen and her daughter-in-law, whom, albeit they were left under his charge and jurisdiction, he nevertheless treated as his ladies paramount. The count was about 40 years of age, and the very mold of manly beauty, in bearing as courteous and chivalrous as ever a gentleman might be, and withal so debonair and dainty, so feat and trim of person that he had not his peer, among the gallants of that day. His wife was dead, leaving him 2 children and no more, to wit, a boy and a girl, still quite young. Now the king and his son being thus away at the war, and the count frequenting the court of the 2 said ladies, and consulting with them upon affairs of state, it so befell that the prince's lady regarded him with no small favor, being very sensible alike of the advantages of his person and the nobility of his bearing, whereby she conceived for him a passion which was all the more ardent because it was secret. And as he was without a wife, and she was still in the freshness of her youth, she saw not why she should not readily be gratified. But supposing that nothing stood in the way but her own shamefastness, she resolved to be rid of that and disclose her mind to him without any reserve. So one day, when she was alone, she seized her opportunity and sent for him, as if she were desirous to converse with him on indifferent topics. The count, his mind entirely aloof from the lady's purpose, presented himself forthwith, and at her invitation sate down by her side on a settee. They were quite alone in the room. But the count had twice asked her the reason why she had so honored him, before, overcome by passion, she broke silence, and crimsoned from neck with shame, half sobbing, trembling in every limb, and at every word she thus spoke. Dearest friend and sweet my lord, sagacity such as yours cannot but be apt to perceive how great is the frailty of men and women, and how, for divers reasons, it varies in different persons in such a degree that no just judge would mete out the same measure to each indifferently, though the fault were apparently the same. Who would not acknowledge that a poor man or woman, fain to earn daily bread by the sweat of the brow, is far more reprehensible in yielding to the solicitations of love than a rich lady, whose life is lapped in ease and unrestricted luxury? Not a soul, I am persuaded, but would so acknowledge. Wherefore I deem that the possession of these boons of fortune should go far indeed to acquit the possessor, if she perchance indulge an errant love. And, for the rest, that, if she have chosen a wise and worthy lover, she should be entirely exonerated. And as I think I may fairly claim the benefit of both these pleas, and of others beside, to wit, my youth and my husband's absence, which naturally incline me to love. 'Tis meet that I now urge them in your presence in defense of my passion. And if they have the weight with you which they should have with the wise, I pray you to afford me your help and counsel in the matter wherein I shall demand it. I avow that in the absence of my husband I have been unable to withstand the promptings of the flesh and the power of love, forces of such potency that even the strongest men, not to speak of delicate women, have not seldom been, nay daily are, overcome by them. And so, living thus, as you see me, in ease and luxury, I have allowed the allurements of love to draw me on, until at last I find myself a prey to passion. Wherein were I discovered, I were, I confess, dishonored, but discovery being avoided, I count the dishonor all but naught. Moreover, love has been so gracious to me that not only has he spared to blind me in the choice of my lover, but he has even lent me his most effective aid, pointing me to one well worthy of the love of a lady such as I, even to yourself, whom, if I misread not my mind, I deem the most handsome and courteous and debonair, and therewithal the sagest cavalier that the realm of France may show. And as you are without a wife, so may I say that I find myself without a husband. Wherefore, in return for this great love I bear you, deny me not, I pray you, yours, but have pity on my youth, which wastes away for you like ice before the fire. These words were followed by such a flood of tears that, albeit she had intended yet further to press her suit, speech failed her. Her eyes drooped, and, almost swooning with emotion, she let her head fall upon the Count's breast. The Count, who was the most loyal of knights, began with all severity to chide her mad passion, and to thrust her from him, for she was now making as if she would throw her arms around his neck and, to asseverate with oaths that he would rather be hewn in pieces than either commit, or abet another in committing such an offense against the honor of his lord, when the lady, catching his drift, and forgetting all her love in a sudden frenzy of rage, cried out, "So, unknightly knight, is it thus you flout my love? Now heaven forbid, but, as you would be the death of me, I either do you to death or drive you from the world." So saying, she disheveled and tore her hair and rent her garments to shreds about her bosom. Which done, she began shrieking at the top of her voice, "Help! Help! The Count of Antwerp threatens to violate me." Whereupon the Count, who knew that a clear conscience was no protection against the envy of courtiers, and doubted that his innocence would prove scarce a match for the cunning of the lady, started to his feet, and hied him with all speed out of the room, out of the palace, and back to his own house. Counsel of none he sought, but forthwith set his children on horseback, and taking horse himself, departed post-haste for Calais. The lady's cries brought not a few to her aid, who, observing her plight, not only gave entire credence to her story, but improved upon it, alleging that the debonair and accomplished Count had long employed all the arts of seduction to compass his end. So they rushed in hot haste to the Count's house, with intent to arrest him, and not finding him, sacked it and razed it to the ground. The news, as glossed and garbled, being carried to the king and prince in the field, they were mightily incensed, and offered a great reward for the Count, dead or alive, and condemned him and his posterity to perpetual banishment. Meanwhile the Count, sorely troubled that by his flight his innocence showed as guilt, pursued his journey, and concealing his identity, and being recognized by none, arrived with his 2 children at Calais. Thence he forthwith crossed to England, and meanly clad fared on for London, taking care as he went to school his children in all that belonged to their new way of life, and especially in 2 main articles. To wit, that they should bear with resignation the poverty to which, by no fault of theirs, but solely by one of fortune's caprices, they and he were reduced, and that they should be most sedulously on their guard to betray to none, as they valued their lives, whence they were, or who their father was. The son, Louis by name, was perhaps 9, and the daughter, Violante, perhaps 7 years of age. For years so tender they proved apt pupils, and afterwards showed by their conduct that they had well learned their father's lesson. He deemed it expedient to change their names, and accordingly called the boy Parrot and the girl Jeanette. So, meanly clad, the Count and his 2 children arrived at London, and there made shift to get a living by going about soliciting alms in the guise of French mendicants. Now, as for this purpose they waited one morning outside a church, it so befell that a great lady, the wife of one of the marshals of the King of England, observed them, as she left the church, asking alms, and demanded of the Count whence he was, and whether the children were his. He answered that he was from Picardy, that the children were his, and that he had been fain to leave Picardy by reason of the misconduct of their reprobate elder brother. The lady looked at the girl, who being fair, and of gentle and winning mien and manners, found much favor in her eyes. So the kind-hearted lady said to the Count, "My good man, if thou art willing to leave thy little daughter with me, I like her looks so well that I will gladly take her. And if she grow up a good woman, I will see that she is suitably married when the right time comes." The Count was much gratified by the proposal, which he forthwith accepted, and parted with the girl, charging the lady with tears to take every care of her. Having thus placed the girl with one in whom he felt sure that he might trust, he determined to tarry no longer in London. Wherefore, taking Parrot with him and begging as he went, he made his way to Wales, not without great suffering, being unused to go afoot. Now in Wales another of the king's marshals had his court, maintaining great state and a large number of retainers. To which court the Count and his son frequently repaired, there to get food. And their Parrot, finding the marshal's son and other gentlemen's sons vying with one another in boyish exercises, as running and leaping, little by little joined their company, and showed himself a match or more for them all in all their contests. The marshal's attention being thus drawn to him, he was well pleased with the boy's mien and bearing, and asked who he was. He was told that he was the son of a poor man, who sometimes came there to solicit alms. Whereupon he asked the Count to let him have the boy, and the Count, to whom God could have granted no greater boon, readily consented, albeit he was very loath to part with Parrot. Having thus provided for his son and daughter, the Count resolved to quit the island, and did so, making his way as best he could to Stamford, in Ireland, where he obtained a menial's place in the service of a knight, retainer to one of the earls of that country, and so abode there a long while, doing all the irksome and wearisome drudgery of a lackey or groom. Meanwhile, under the care of the gentle lady at London, Violante, or Ginette, increased, as in years and stature so also in beauty, and in such favor with the lady and her husband and every other member of the household, and all who knew her, that 'twas a wonder to see. Nor was there any that, observing her bearing and manners, would not have said that estate or dignity there was none so high or honorable, but she was worthy of it. So the lady, who, since she had received her from her father, had been unable to learn aught else about him than what he had himself told, was minded to marry her honorably according to what she deemed to be her rank. But God, who justly apportions reward according to merit, having regard to her noble birth, her innocence, and the load of suffering which the sin of another had laid upon her, ordered otherwise. And in his good providence, lest the young gentlewoman should be mated with a churl, permitted, we must believe, events to take the course they did. The gentle lady with whom Ginette lived had an only son, whom she and her husband loved most dearly, as well because he was a son as for his rare and noble qualities. For in truth there were few that could compare with him in courtesy and courage and personal beauty. Now the young man marked the extraordinary beauty and grace of Ginette, who was about 6 years his junior, and fell so desperately in love with her that he had no eyes for any other maiden. But deeming her to be of low degree, he not only hesitated to ask her of his parents in marriage, but, fearing to incur reproof for indulging a passion for an inferior, he did his utmost to conceal his love, whereby it gave him far more disquietude than if he had avowed it, insomuch that so extreme waxed his suffering he fell ill, and that seriously. Divers physicians were called in, but, for all their scrutiny of his symptoms, they could not determine the nature of his malady, and one and all gave him up for lost. Nothing could exceed the sorrow and dejection of his father and mother, who again and again piteously implored him to discover to them the cause of his malady, and received no other answer than sighs or complaints that he seemed to be wasting away. Now it so happened that one day Ginette, who from regard for his mother was sedulous in waiting upon him, for some reason or another came into the room where he lay, while a very young but very skillful physician sate by him and held his pulse. The young man gave her not a word or other sign of recognition, but his passion waxed, his heart smote him, and the acceleration of his pulse at once betrayed his inward commotion to the physician, who, albeit surprised, remained quietly attentive to see how long it would last, and observing that it ceased when Ginette left the room, conjectured that he was on the way to explain the young man's malady. So, after a while, still holding the young man's pulse, he sent for Ginette, as if he had something to ask of her. She returned forthwith. The young man's pulse mounted as soon as she entered the room, and fell again as soon as she left it. Wherefore the physician no longer hesitated, but rose, and taking the young man's father and mother aside, said to them, "The restoration of your son's health rests not with medical skill, but solely with Ginette, whom, as by unmistakable signs I have discovered, he ardently loves, though so far I can see, she is not aware of it. So you know what you have to do, if you value his life." The prospect thus afforded of their son's deliverance from death reassured the gentleman and his lady, albeit they were troubled, misdoubting it must be by his marriage with Ginette. So, when the physician was gone, they went to the sick lad, and the lady thus spoke. "My son, never would I have believed that thou wouldst have concealed from me any desire of thine, least of all if such it were that privation should cause thee to languish. For well assured thou shouldst have been and shouldst be, that I hold thee dear as my very self, and that whatever may be for thy contentment, even though it were scarce seemly, I would do it for thee. But for all thou hast so done, God has shewn himself more merciful to theward than thyself, and lest thou die of this malady, has given me to know its cause, which is nothing else than the excessive love which thou bearest to a young woman, be she who she may. Which love in good sooth thou needest not have been ashamed to declare, for it is but natural at thy age, and hadst thou not loved, I should have deemed thee of very little worth. So, my son, be not shy of me, but frankly discover to me thy whole heart, and away with this gloom and melancholy whereof thy sickness is engendered, and be comforted, and assure thyself that there is naught that thou mayst require of me which I will not do to give thee ease, so far as my powers may reach, seeing that thou art dearer to me than my own life. Away with thy shamefastness and fears, and tell me if there is aught wherein I may be helpful to thee in the matter of thy love. And if I bestir not myself and bring it to pass, account me the most harsh mother that ever bore son." The young man was at first somewhat shamefast to hear his mother thus speak, but reflecting that none could do more for his happiness than she, he took courage, and thus spoke. "Madam, my sole reason for concealing my love from you was that I have observed that old people for the most part forget that they once were young. But as I see that no such unreasonableness is to be apprehended in you, I not only acknowledge the truth of what you say that you have discerned, but I will also disclose to you the object of my passion, on the understanding that your promise shall to the best of your power be performed, as it must be, if I am to be restored to you in sound health." Whereupon the lady, making too sure of that which was destined to fall out otherwise than she expected, gave him every encouragement to discover all his heart, and promised to lose no time and spare no pains in endeavoring to compass his gratification. "Madam," said then the young man, "the rare beauty and exquisite manners of our Ginette, my powerlessness to make her understand I do not say commiserate my love, and my reluctance to disclose it to any, have brought me to the condition in which you see me, and if your promise be not in one way or another performed, be sure that my life will be brief." The lady, deeming that the occasion called rather for comfort than for admonition, replied with a smile, "Ah, my son, was this then of all things the secret of thy suffering? Be of good cheer, and leave me to arrange the affair when you are recovered." So, animated by a cheerful hope, the young man speedily gave sign of a most marked improvement, which the lady observed with great satisfaction, and then began to cast about how she might keep her promise. So one day she sent for Ginette, and in a tone of gentle raillery asked her if she had a lover. Ginette turned very red as she answered, "Madam, 'twould scarce, nay, 'twould ill become a damsel such as I, poor outcast from home, and in the service of another, to occupy herself with thoughts of love." Whereto the lady answered, "So you have none, we will give you one, who will brighten all your life and give you more joy of your beauty, for it is not right that so fair a damsel as you remain without a lover." "Madam," rejoined Ginette, "you found me living in poverty with my father, you adopted me, you have brought me up as your daughter. Wherefore I should, if possible, comply with your every wish. But in this matter I will render you no compliance, nor do I doubt that I do well. So you will give me a husband, will love him, but no other will I love. For, as patrimony I now have none save my honor, that I am minded to guard and preserve while my life shall last." Serious though the obstacle was which these words opposed to the plan by which the lady had intended to keep her promise to her son, her sound judgment could not but secretly acknowledge that the spirit which they evinced was much to be commended in the damsel. Wherefore she said, Nay, but Jeanette, suppose that our lord the king, who is a young knight as thou art a most fair damsel, craved some indulgence of thy love, wouldst thou deny him? The king, returned Jeanette without the least hesitation, might constrain me, but with my consent he should never have aught of me that was not honorable. Whereto the lady made no answer, for she now understood the girl's temper. But being minded to put her to the proof, she told her son that, as soon as he was recovered, she would arrange that he should be closeted with her in the same room, and be thus able to use all his arts to bring her to his will, saying that it ill became her to play the part of procuress and urge her son's suit upon her own maid. But as the young man, by no means approving this idea, suddenly grew worse, the lady at length opened her mind to Jeanette, whom she found in the same frame as before, and indeed even more resolute. Wherefore she told her husband all that she had done, and as both preferred that their son should marry beneath him, and live, than that he should remain single and die, they resolved, albeit much disconcerted, to give Jeanette to him to wife, and so after long debate they did. Whereat Jeanette was overjoyed, and with devout heart gave thanks to God that he had not forgotten her. Nevertheless, she still gave no other account of herself than that she was the daughter of a Picard. So the young man recovered, and blithe at heart as ne'er another, was married, and began to speed the time gaily with his bride. Meanwhile Parrot, left in Wales with the Marshal of the King of England, had likewise with increase of years increase of favour with his master, and grew up most shapely and well-favoured, and of such prowess that in all the island at tourney or joust or any other passage of arms he had not his peer, being everywhere known and renowned as Parrot the Picard. And as God had not forgotten Jeanette, so likewise he made manifest by what follows that he had not forgotten Parrot. Well-nigh half the population of those parts being swept off by a sudden visitation of deadly pestilence, most of the survivors fled therefrom in a panic, so that the country was, to all appearance, entirely deserted. Among those that died of the pest were the marshal, his lady, and his son, besides brothers and nephews and kinsfolk in great number. Whereby of his entire household there were left only one of his daughters, now marriageable, and a few servants, among them Parrot. Now Parrot being a man of such notable prowess, the damsel, soon after the pestilence had spent itself, took him, with the approval and by the advice of the few folk that survived, to be her husband, and made him lord of all that fell to her by inheritance. Nor was it long before the King of England, learning that the Marshal was dead, made Parrot the Picard, to whose merit he was no stranger, Marshal in the dead man's room. Such, in brief, was the history of the two innocent children, with whom the Count of Antwerp had parted, never expecting to see them again. 'Twas now the 18th year since the Count of Antwerp had taken flight from Paris, when, being still in Ireland, where he had led a very sorry and suffering sort of life, and feeling that age was now come upon him, he felt a longing to learn, if possible, what was become of his children. The fashion of his outward man was now completely changed, for long hardship had, as he well knew, given to his age a vigor which his youth, lapped in ease, had lacked. So he hesitated not to take his leave of the knight with whom he had so long resided, and poor and in sorry trim he crossed to England, and made his way to the place where he had left Parrot to find him a great lord and marshal of the king, and in good health, and withal a hearty man and very handsome. All which was very grateful to the old man, but yet he would not make himself known to his son until he had learned the fate of Jeanette. So forth he fared again, nor did he halt until he was come to London, where, cautiously questing about for news of the lady with whom he had left his daughter, and how it fared with her, he learned that Jeanette was married to the lady's son. Whereat, in the great gladness of his heart, he counted all his past adversity but a light matter, since he had found his children alive and prosperous. But sore he yearned to see Jeanette. Wherefore he took to loitering, as poor folk are wont, in the neighbourhood of the house. And so one day Jacques Lamian, such was the name of Jeanette's husband, saw him and had pity on him, observing that he was poor and aged, and bade one of his servants take him indoors, and for God's sake give him something to eat, and nothing loath the servant did so. Now Ginette had borne Jacques several children, the finest and the most winsome children in the world, the eldest no more than 8 years old, who gathered about the Count as he ate, and, as if by instinct divining that he was their grandfather, began to make friends with him. He, knowing them for his grandchildren, could not conceal his love, and repaid them with caresses, insomuch that they would not hearken to their governor when he called them, but remained with the Count. Which being reported to Ginette, she came out of her room, crossed to where the Count was sitting with the children, and bade them do as their master told them, or she would certainly have them whipped. The children began to cry, and to say that they would rather stay with the worthy man, whom they liked much better than their master, whereat both the lady and the Count laughed in sympathy. The Count had risen, with no other intention, for he was not minded to disclose his paternity than to pay his daughter the respect due from his poverty to her rank, and the sight of her had thrilled his soul with a wondrous delight. By her he was and remained unrecognized, utterly changed as he was from his former self, aged, gray-haired, bearded, lean and tanned, in short, to all appearance another man than the Count. However, seeing that the children were unwilling to leave him, but wept when she made as if she would constrain them, she bade the master let them be for a time. So the children remained with the worthy man, until by chance Jacques' father came home, and learned from the master what had happened. Whereupon, having a grudge against Ginette, he said, "Let them be, and God give them the ill luck which he owes them. Whence they sprang, thither they must needs return. They descend from a vagabond on the mother's side, and so 'tis no wonder that they consort readily with vagabonds." The Count caught these words and was sorely pained, but, shrugging his shoulders, bore the affront silently as he had borne many another. Jacques, who had noted his children's fondness for the worthy man, to wit, the Count, was displeased. But nevertheless, such was the love he bore them, that, rather than see them weep, he gave order that, if the worthy man cared to stay there in his service, he should be received. The Count answered that he would gladly do so, but that he was fit for nothing except to look after horses, to which he had been used all his life. So a horse was assigned him, and when he had groomed him, he occupied himself in playing with the children. While fortune thus shaped the destinies of the Count of Antwerp and his children, it so befell that after a long series of truces made with the Germans, the King of France died, and his crown passed to his son, whose wife had been the occasion of the Count's banishment. The new king, as soon as the last truce with the Germans was run out, renewed hostilities with extraordinary vigor, being aided by his brother of England with a large army under the command of his marshal, Perrot, and his other marshal's son, Jacques Lamiens. With them went the worthy man, that is to say, the Count, who, unrecognized by any, served for a long while in the army in the capacity of groom, and acquitted himself both in council and in arms with a wisdom and valor unwanted in one of his supposed rank. The war was still raging when the Queen of France fell seriously ill, and, as she felt her end approach, made a humble and contrite confession of all her sins to the Archbishop of Rouen, who was universally reputed a good and most holy man. Among her other sins, she confessed the great wrong that she had done to the Count of Antwerp. Nor was she satisfied to confide it to the Archbishop, but recounted the whole affair, as it had passed, to not a few other worthy men, whom she besought to use their influence with the king to procure the restitution of the Count, if he were still alive, and if not, of his children, to honor and estate. And so, dying shortly afterwards, she was honorably buried. The Queen's confession wrung from the king a sigh or two of compunction for a brave man cruelly wronged. After which he caused proclamation to be made throughout the army, and in many other parts, that whoso should bring him tidings of the Count of Antwerp, or his children, should receive from him such a guerdon for each of them as should justly be matter of marvel. Seeing that he held him acquitted, by confession of the Queen, of the crime for which he had been banished, and was therefore now minded to grant him not only restitution, but increase of honor and estate. Now the Count, being still with the army in his character of groom, heard the proclamation, which he did not doubt was made in good faith. Wherefore he hied him forthwith to Jacques, and begged a private interview with him and Perrot, that he might discover to them that whereof the king was in quest. So the meeting was had, and Perrot was on the point of declaring himself when the Count anticipated him, parrot," he said, "Jacques here has thy sister to wife, but never a dowry had he with her. Wherefore that thy sister be not dowerless. 'Tis my will that he, and no other, have this great reward which the king offers for thee, son, as he shall certify, of the Count of Antwerp, and for his wife and thy sister Violante, and for me, Count of Antwerp, thy father." So hearing, Parrot scanned the Count closely, and forthwith recognizing him, burst into tears, and throwing himself at his feet embraced him, saying, "My father, welcome, welcome indeed art thou." Whereupon, between what he had heard from the Count and what he had witnessed on the part of Parrot, Jacques was so overcome with wonder and delight that at first he was at a loss to know how to act. However, giving entire credence to what he had heard, and recalling insulting language which he had used towards the quondam groom, the Count, he was sore stricken with shame, and wept and fell at the Count's feet, and humbly craved his pardon for all past offences, which the Count, raising him to his feet, most graciously granted him. So with many a tear and many a hearty laugh, the three men compared their several fortunes, which done, Parrot and Jacques would have arrayed the Count in manner befitting his rank, but he would by no means suffer it, being minded that Jacques, so soon as he was well assured that the guerdon was forthcoming, should present him to the king in his garb of groom, that thereby the king might be the more shamed. So Jacques, with the Count and Parrot, went presently to the king, and offered to present to him the Count and his children, provided the guerdon were forthcoming according to the proclamation. Jacques wondered not a little as forthwith at a word from the king a guerdon was produced ample for all three, and he was bidden take it away with him, so only that he should in very truth produce, as he had promised, the Count and his children in the royal presence. Then, withdrawing a little and causing his quondam groom, now Count, to come forward with Parrot, he said, "Sire, father and son are before you. The daughter, my wife, is not here, but God willing, you shall soon see her." So hearing, the king surveyed the Count, whom notwithstanding his greatly changed appearance, he at length recognized, and well nigh moved to tears, he raised him from his knees to his feet, and kissed and embraced him. He also gave a kindly welcome to Parrot, and bade forthwith furnish the Count with apparel, servants, and horses suited to his rank, all which was no sooner said than done. Moreover, the king showed Jacques no little honor, and particularly questioned him of all his past adventures. As Jacques was about to take the noble guerdons assigned him for the discovery of the Count and his children, the Count said to him, "Take these tokens of the magnificence of our lord the king, and forget not to tell thy father that 'tis from no vagabond that thy children, his and my grandchildren, descend on the mother's side." So Jacques took the guerdons, and sent for his wife and mother to join him at Paris. Thither also came Parrot's wife, and there with all magnificence they were entertained by the Count, to whom the king had not only restored all his former estates and honors, but added thereto others, whereby he was now become a greater man than he had ever been before. Then with the Count's leave they all returned to their several houses. The Count himself spent the rest of his days at Paris, in greater glory than ever. Novel 9. Bernabo of Genoa, deceived by Ambrogiulo, loses his money and commands his innocent wife to be put to death. She escapes, habits herself as a man, and serves the Soldan. She discovers the deceiver and brings Bernabo to Alexandria, where the deceiver is punished. She then resumes the garb of a woman, and with her husband returns wealthy to Genoa. When Alyssa had performed her part and brought her touching story to a close, Queen Philomena, a damsel no less stately than fair of person, and of a surpassingly sweet and smiling mien, having composed herself to speak, thus began, "Our engagements with Dioneo shall be faithfully observed. Wherefore, as he and I alone remain to complete the day's narration, I will tell my story first, and he shall have the grace he craved, and be the last to speak." After which prelude she thus began her story. "'Tis a proverb current among the vulgar that the deceived has the better of the deceiver. A proverb which, were it not exemplified by events, might hardly in any manner be justified. Wherefore, while adhering to our theme, I am minded at the same time, dearest ladies, to show you that there is truth in this proverb. The proof whereof should be none the less welcome to you, that it may put you on your guard against deceivers. Know then that certain very great merchants of Italy, being met, as merchants use, for divers reasons proper to each, at a hostelry in Paris, and having one evening jovially supped together, fell a talking of divers matters, and so, passing from one topic to another, they came at last to discuss the ladies whom they had left at home, and one jocosely said, "Cannot answer for my wife. But for myself I own, that, whenever a girl that is to my mind comes in my way, I give the go-by to the love that I bear my wife, and take my pleasure of the newcomer to the best of my power." "And so do I," said another, "because I know that, whether I suspect her or no, my wife tries her fortune, and so, tease do as you are done by, the ass and the wall are quits." A third added his testimony to the same effect. And in short, all seemed to concur in the opinion that the ladies they had left behind them were not likely to neglect their opportunities, when one, a Genos, Bernabo Lomelin by name, dissociated himself from the rest, affirming that by a special grace of God, he was blessed with a wife who was, perhaps, the most perfect paragon to be found in Italy of all the virtues proper to a lady, aye, and in great measure, to a knight or squire. Inasmuch as she was fair, still quite young, handy, hearty, and clever beyond all other women in embroidery work and all other forms of ladies' handicraft. Moreover, so well-mannered, discreet, and sensible was she was as fit to wait at a lord's table as any squire or manservant or such like, the best and most adroit that could be found. To which encomium he added that she knew how to manage a horse, fly a hawk, read, write, and cast up accounts better than as if she were a merchant. And after much more in the same strain of commendation, he came at length to the topic of their conversation, asseverating with an oath that 'twas not possible to find a woman more honest, more chaste than she. Nay, he verily believed that, if he remained from home for 10 years, or indeed for the rest of his days, she would never think of any of these casual amours with any other man. Among the merchants who thus gossiped was a young man, Ambrogiulo da Piacenza, by name, who, when Bernabo thus concluded his eulogy of his wife, broke out into a mighty laugh, and asked him with a leer, whether he of all men had this privilege by special patent of the emperor. Bernabo replied, somewhat angrily, that 'twas a boon conferred upon him by God, who is rather more powerful than the emperor. To which Ambrogiulo rejoined, "Make no doubt, Bernabo, that thou believest that what thou sayst is true, but, methinks, thou hast been but a careless observer of the nature of things. Otherwise, I do not take thee to be of so gross understanding, but that thou must have discerned therein reasons for speaking more judiciously of this matter. And that thou mayst not think that we, who have spoken with much freedom about our wives, deem them to be of another nature and mold than thine, but mayst know that we have but uttered what common sense dictates. I am minded to go a little further into this matter with thee. Have always understood that of all mortal beings created by God, man is the most noble, and next after him woman. Man, then, being, as is universally believed, and is indeed apparent by his works, more perfect than woman, must without doubt be endowed with more firmness and constancy, women being one and all more mobile, for reasons not a few and founded in nature, which I might adduce, but mean for the present to pass over. And yet, for all his greater firmness, man cannot withstand, I do not say, a woman's supplications, but the mere lust of the eye which she unwittingly excites, and that in such sort that he will do all that is in his power to induce her to pleasure him, not once, perhaps, in the course of a month, but 1,000 times a day. How then shouldst thou expect a woman, mobile by nature, to resist the supplications, the flatteries, the gifts, and all the other modes of attack that an accomplished seducer will employ? Thou thinkest that she may hold out. Nay, verily, affirm it as thou mayst, I doubt thou dost not really so think. Thou dost not deny that thy wife is a woman, a creature of flesh and blood like the rest. And if so, she must have the same cravings, the same natural propensities as they, and no more force to withstand them, wherefore 'tis at least possible, that, however honest she be, she will do as others do. And not that is possible admits such peremptory denial or affirmation of its contrary as this of thine. Whereto Bernabo returned, I am a merchant and no philosopher, and I will give thee a merchant's answer. I acknowledge that what thou sayst is true of vain and foolish women who have no modesty, but such as are discreet are so sensitive in regard of their honor that they become better able to preserve it than men, who have no such solicitude, and my wife is one of this sort. Doubtless, observed Ambrogiulo, few would be found to indulge in these casual amours, if every time they did so a horn grew out on the brow to attest the fact. But not only does no horn make its appearance, but not so much as a trace or vestige of a horn, so only they be but prudent. And the shame and dishonor consist only in the discovery. Wherefore, if they can do it secretly, they do it, or are fools to refrain. Hold it for certain that she alone is chaste, who either had never suit made to her, or, suing herself, was repulsed. And albeit, I know that for reasons true and founded in nature, this must needs be. Yet I should not speak so positively thereof as I do, had I not many a time with many a woman verified it by experience. And I assure thee that, had I but access to this most saintly wife of thine, I should confidently expect very soon to have the same success with her as with others. Then Bernabo angrily, "'Twere long and tedious to continue this discussion. I should have my say, and thou thine, and in the end, 'twould come to nothing. But as thou say'st that they are all so compliant, and that thou art so accomplished a seducer, I give thee this pledge of the honor of my wife. I consent to forfeit my head, if thou shouldst succeed in bringing her to pleasure thee in such a sort. And shouldst thou fail, thou shalt forfeit to me no more than 1,000 florins of gold." Elated by this unexpected offer, Ambrogiolo replied, "I know not what I should do with thy blood, Bernabo, if I won the wager. But if thou wouldst have proof of what I have told thee, lay 5,000 florins of gold, which must be worth less to thee than thy head, against 1,000 of mine. And, whereas thou makest no stipulation as to time, I will bind myself to go to Genoa, and within 3 months from my departure hence to have had my pleasure of thy wife, and in witness thereof to bring back with me, of the things which she prizes most dearly. Evidence of her compliance, so weighty and conclusive, that thou thyself shalt admit the fact. Nor do I require aught of thee, but that thou pledge thy faith neither to come to Genoa, nor to write word to her of this matter during the said 3 months." Bernabo professed himself well content, and though the rest of the company, seeing that the compact might well have very evil consequences, did all that they could to frustrate it, yet the 2 men were now so heated that, against the will of the others, they set it down fairly in writing, and signed it each with his own hand. This done, Ambrogiolo, leaving Bernabo at Paris, posted with all speed for Genoa. Arrived there, he set to work with great caution, and having found out the quarter in which the lady resided, he learned in the course of a few days enough about her habits of life and her character to know that what Bernabo had told him was rather less than the truth. So recognizing that his enterprise was hopeless, he cast about for some device whereby he might cover his defeat, and having got speech of a poor woman, who was much in the lady's house as also in her favor, he bribed her, other means failing, to convey him in a chest, which he had made for the purpose, not only into the house but into the bedroom of the lady, whom the good woman, following Bernabo's instructions, induced to take charge of it for some days, during which, she said, she would be away. So the lady suffered the chest to remain in the room, and when the night was so far spent that Bernabo thought she must be asleep, he opened it with some tools with which he had provided himself, and stole softly out. There was a light in the room, so that he was able to form an idea of its situation, to take note of the pictures and everything else of consequence that it contained, and to commit the whole to memory. This done, he approached the bed, and observing that the lady and a little girl that was with her were fast asleep, he gently uncovered her, and saw that nude she was not a whit less lovely than when dressed. He looked about for some mark that might serve him as evidence that he had seen her in this state, but found nothing except a mole, which she had under the left breast, and which was fringed with a few fair hairs that shone like gold. So beautiful was she that he was tempted at the hazard of his life to take his place by her side in the bed, but remembering what he had heard of her inflexible obduracy in such affairs, he did not venture, but quietly replaced the bedclothes, and having passed the best part of the night very much at his ease in her room, he took from one of the lady's boxes a purse, a gown, a ring, and a girdle, and with these tokens returned to the chest, and locked himself in as before. In this manner he passed 2 nights, nor did the lady in the least suspect his presence. On the 3rd day, the good woman came by preconcert to fetch her chest, and took it back to the place whence she had brought it. So Ambrogiolo got out, paid her the stipulated sum, and hied him back with all speed to Paris, where he arrived within the appointed time. Then, in presence of the merchants who were witnesses of his altercation with Bernabo, and the wager to which it had given occasion, he told Bernabo that he had won the bet, having done what he had boasted that he would do. And in proof thereof he first of all described the appearance of the room and the pictures, and then displayed the articles belonging to the lady which he had brought away with him, averring that she had given them to him. Bernabo acknowledged the accuracy of his description of the room, and that the articles did really belong to his wife, but objected that Ambroggiolo might have learned characteristic features of the room from one of the servants, and have come by the things in a similar way. And therefore, unless he had something more to say, he could not justly claim to have won the bet. Verily, rejoined Ambroggiolo, this should suffice, but as thou requirest that I say somewhat further, I will satisfy thee. I say then that Madame Zinevra, thy wife, has under her left breast a mole of some size, around which are, perhaps, 6 hairs of a golden hue. As Bernabo heard this, it was as if a knife pierced his heart, so poignant was his suffering, and though no word escaped him, the complete alteration of his mien bore unmistakable witness to the truth of Ambroggiolo's words. After a while he said, Gentlemen, 'tis even as Ambroggiolo says, he has won the bet. He has but to come when he will, and he shall be paid. And so the very next day Ambroggiolo was paid in full, and Bernabo, intent on wreaking vengeance on his wife, left Paris and set his face towards Genoa. He had no mind, however, to go home, and accordingly halted at an estate which he had some 20 miles from the city, whither he sent forward a servant, in whom he reposed much trust, with 2 horses and a letter advising the lady of his return, and bidding her come out to meet him. At the same time, he gave the servant secret instructions to choose some convenient place, and ruthlessly put the lady to death, and so returned to him. On his arrival at Genoa, the servant delivered his message and the letter to the lady, who received him with great cheer, and next morning got on horseback and set forth with him for her husband's estate. So they rode on, talking of divers matters, until they came to a deep gorge very lonely, and shut in by high rocks and trees. The servant, deeming this just the place in which he might without risk of discovery fulfill his lord's behest, whipped out a knife, and seizing the lady by the arm said, Madam, commend your soul to God, for here must end at once your journey and your life. Terror-stricken by what she saw and heard, the lady cried out, Mercy for God's sake, before thou slay me, tell me at least wherein I have wronged thee, that thou art thus minded to put me to death. Madam, said the servant, me you have in no wise wronged. But your husband how you may have wronged him I know not charged me show you no mercy, but to slay you on this journey, and threaten to have me hanged by the neck, should I not do so. You know well how bound I am to him, and that I may not disobey any of his commands. God knows I pity you, but yet I can no otherwise. Whereat the lady burst into tears, saying, Mercy for God's sake, make not thyself the murderer of one that has done thee no wrong, at the behest of another. The all-seeing God knows that I never did aught to merit such requital at my husband's hands. But enough of this for the present. There is a way in which thou canst serve at once God and thy master and myself, if thou wilt do as I bid thee. Take, then, these clothes of mine, and give me in exchange just thy doublet and a hood, and carry the clothes with thee to my lord and thine, and tell him that thou hast slain me. And I swear to thee by the life which I shall have received at thy hands, that I will get me gone, and there abide whence news of me shall never reach either him or thee or these parts. The servant, being loath to put her to death, soon yielded to pity, and so he took her clothes, allowing her to retain a little money that she had, and gave her one of his worser doublets and a hood. Then, praying her to depart the country, he left her afoot in the gorge, and returned to his master, whom he gave to understand that he had not only carried out his orders, but had left the lady's body a prey to wolves. Bernabo after a while returned to Genoa, where, the supposed murder being bruited abroad, he was severely censured. Alone and disconsolate, the lady, as night fell, disguised herself as best she could, and hied her to a neighboring village, where, having procured what was needful from an old woman, she shortened the doublet and fitted it to her figure, converted her chemise into a pair of breeches, cut her hair close, and in short, completely disguised herself as a sailor. She then made her way to the coast, where by chance she encountered a Catalan gentleman, by name Segner and Cararc, who had landed from one of his ships, which lay in the offing, to recreate himself at Alba, where there was a fountain. So she made overture to him of her services, was engaged and taken aboard the ship, assuming the name Sicurano de Finale. The gentleman put her in better trim as to clothes, and found her so apt and handy at service that he was exceeding well pleased with her. Not long afterwards, the Catalan sailed one of his carracks to Alexandria. He took with him some peregrine falcons, which he presented to the Soldan, who feasted him once or twice. And noting with approbation the behavior of Cicerano, who always attended his master, he craved him of the Catalan, which request the Catalan reluctantly granted. Cicerano proved so apt for his new service that he was soon as high in grace and favor with the Soldan as he had been with the Catalan. Wherefore, when the time of year came at which there was wont to be held at Acre, then under the Soldan's sway, a great fair, much frequented by merchants, Christian and Saracen alike, and to which, for the security of the merchants and their goods, the Soldan always sent one of his great officers of state with other officers and a guard to attend upon them, he determined to send Cicerano, who by this time knew the language very well. So Cicerano was sent to Acre as governor and captain of the guard for the protection of the merchants and merchandise. Arrived there, he bestirred himself with great zeal in all matters appertaining to his office. And as he went his rounds of inspection, he espied among the merchants not a few from Italy, Sicilians, Pisans, Genoese, Venetians, and so forth, with whom he consorted the more readily because they reminded him of his native land. And so it befell that, alighting once at a shop belonging to some Venetian merchants, he saw there among other trinkets a purse and a girdle, which he forthwith recognized as having once been his own. Concealing his surprise, he blandly asked whose they were, and if they were for sale. He was answered by Ambrogiulo de Piacenza, who had come thither with much merchandise aboard a Venetian ship, and hearing that the captain of the guard was asking about the ownership of the purse and girdle, came forward and said with a smile, "The things are mine, sir, and I am not disposed to sell them, but if they take your fancy, I will gladly give them to you." Observing the smile, Cicerano misdoubted that something had escaped him by which Ambrogiulo had recognized him, but he answered with a composed air, "Thou dost smile, perchance, to see me, a soldier, come asking about this woman's gear?" "Not so, sir," returned Ambrogiulo. "I smile to think of the manner in which I came by it." "And pray," said Cicerano, "if thou hast no reason to conceal it, tell me, in God's name, how thou didst come by the things." "Why, sir," said Ambrogiulo, "they were given me by a Genoese lady, with whom I once spent a night, Madame Zinvra by name, wife of Bernabo Lomelin, who prayed me to keep them as a token of her love. I smiled just now to think of the folly of Bernabo, who was so mad as to stake 5,000 florins of gold, against my 1,000 that I could not bring his wife to surrender to me, which I did. I won the bet, and he, who should rather have been punished for his insensate folly than she for doing what all women do, had her put to death, as I afterwards gathered, on his way back from Paris to Genoa." Ambrogiulo had not done speaking before Cicerano had discerned in him the evident cause of her husband's animosity against her, and all her woe, and had made up her mind that he should not escape with impunity. She therefore feigned to be much interested by this story, consorted frequently and very familiarly with Ambrogiulo, and insidiously captured his confidence, insomuch that at her suggestion, when the fair was done, he, taking with him all his wares, accompanied her to Alexandria, where she provided him with a shop, and put no little of her own money in his hands, so that he, finding it very profitable, was glad enough to stay. Anxious to make her innocence manifest to Bernabo, Cicerano did not rest until, with the help of some great Genoese merchants that were in Alexandria, she had devised an expedient to draw him thither. Her plan succeeded. Bernabo arrived, and, as he was now very poor, she privily arranged that he should be entertained by one of her friends until occasion should serve to carry out her design. She had already induced Ambrogiulo to tell his story to the Soldan, and the Soldan to interest himself in the matter. So Bernabo being come, and further delay inexpedient, she seized her opportunity, and persuaded the Soldan to cite Ambrogiulo and Bernabo before him, that in Bernabo's presence Ambrogiulo might be examined of his boast touching Bernabo's wife, and the truth hereof, if not to be had from him by gentle means, be elicited by torture. So the Soldan, having Ambrogiulo and Bernabo before him, amid a great concourse of his people, questioned Ambrogiulo of the 5,000 florins of gold that he had won from Bernabo, and sternly bade him tell the truth. Still more harsh was the aspect of Sicurano, in whom Ambrogiulo had placed his chief reliance, but who now threatened him with the direst torments if the truth were not forthcoming. Thus hard bested on this side and on that, and in a manner coerced, Ambrogiulo, thinking he had but to refund, in presence of Bernabo and many others accurately recounted the affair as it had happened. When he had done, Sicurano, as minister of the Soldan for the time being, turned to Bernabo and said, "And thy wife, thus falsely accused, what treatment did she meet with at thy hands?" "Mortified," said Bernabo, "by the loss of my money, and the dishonor which I deemed to have been done me by my wife, I was so overcome by wrath that I had her put to death by one of my servants, who brought me word that her corpse had been instantly devoured by a pack of wolves." Albeit the Soldan had heard and understood all that had passed, yet he did not as yet apprehend the object for which Sicurano had pursued the investigation. Wherefore Sicurano thus addressed him: "My lord, what cause this good lady has to boast of her lover and her husband you have now abundant means of judging, seeing that the lover at one and the same time despoils her of her honor, blasting her fair fame with slanderous accusations, and ruins her husband, who, more prompt to trust the falsehood of another than the verity of which his own long experience should have assured him, devotes her to death and the devouring wolves. And moreover, such is the regard, such the love which both bear her that, though both tarry a long time with her, neither recognizes her. However, that you may know full well what chastisements they have severally deserved, I will now cause her to appear in your presence and theirs, provided you, of your especial grace, be pleased to punish the deceiver and pardon the deceived." The Soldan, being minded in this matter to defer entirely to Sicurano, answered that he was well content and bade produce the lady. Bernabo, who had firmly believed that she was dead, was lost in wonder. Likewise Ambrogiulo, who now divined his evil plight, and dreading something worse than the disbursement of money, knew not whether to expect the lady's advent with fear or with hope. His suspense was not of long duration, for, as soon as the Soldan signified his assent, Sicurano, weeping, threw herself on her knees at his feet, and discarding the tones, as she would fain have divested herself of the outward semblance, of a man, said, "My lord, that forlorn, hapless Zinevra am I, falsely and foully slandered by this traitor Ambrogiulo, and by my cruel and unjust husband delivered over to his servant to slaughter and cast out as a prey to the wolves. For which cause I have now for 6 years been a wanderer on the face of the earth in the guise of a man." Then rending her robes in front and baring her breast, she made it manifest to the Soldan and all others who were present, that she was indeed a woman. Then turning to Ambrogiulo, she haughtily challenged him to say when she had ever lain with him, as he had boasted. Ambrogiulo said never a word, for he now recognized her, and it was as if shame had reft from him the power of speech. The Soldan, who had never doubted that Sicurano was a man, was so wonderstruck by what he saw, and heard that at times he thought it must be all a dream. But as wonder gave place to conviction of the truth, he extolled in the amplest terms the constancy and virtue and seemliness with which Zinevra, erstwhile Sicurano, had ordered her life. He then directed that she should be most nobly arrayed in the garb of her sex, and surrounded by a bevy of ladies. Mindful of her intercession, he granted to Bernabo the life which he had forfeited. And she, when Bernabo threw himself at her feet and wept and craved her pardon, raised him, unworthy though he was, to his feet and generously forgave him, and tenderly embraced him as her husband. Ambrogiulo the Soldan commanded to be bound to a stake, that his bare flesh, anointed with honey, might be exposed to the sun on one of the heights of the city, there to remain until it should fall to pieces of its own accord. And so 'twas done. He then decreed that the lady should have the traitor's estate, which was worth not less, but rather more than 10,000 doubloons. Whereto he added, in jewels and vessels of gold and silver, and in money, the equivalent of upwards of other 10,000 doubloons, having first entertained her and her husband with most magnificent and ceremonious cheer, accordant with the lady's worth. Which done, he placed a ship at their disposal, and gave them leave to return to Genoa at their pleasure. So to Genoa they returned very rich and happy, and were received with all honor, especially Madame Zinevra, whom all the citizens had believed to be dead, and whom thenceforth, so long as she lived, they held of great consequence and excellency. As for Ambrogiulo, the very same day that he was bound to the stake. The honey with which his body was anointed attracted such swarms of flies, wasps, and gadflies, wherewith that country abounds, that not only was his life sucked from him, but his very bones were completely denuded of flesh. In which state, hanging by the sinews, they remained a long time undisturbed, for a sign and a testimony of his baseness to all that passed by. And so the deceived had the better of the deceiver. Novel 10. Paganino de Monaco carries off the wife of Messer Ricciardo di Cinzica, who, having learned where she is, goes to Paganino and in a friendly manner asks him to restore her. He consents, provided she be willing. She refuses to go back with her husband. Messer Ricciardo dies, and she marries Paganino. Their queen's story, by its beauty, elicited hearty commendation from all the honorable company, and most especially from Dionio, with whom it now rested to conclude the day's narration. Again and again he renewed his eulogy of the queen's story, and then began on this wise. Fair ladies, there is that in the queen's story which has caused me to change my purpose, and substitute another story for that which I had meant to tell. I refer to the insensate folly of Bernabo, well though it was with him in the end, and of all others who delude themselves, as he seemed to do, with the vain imagination that, while they go about the world, taking their pleasure now of this, now of the other woman, their wives, left at home, suffer not their hands to stray from their girdles. As if we who are born of them and bred among them could be ignorant of the bent of their desires. Wherefore, by my story I purpose at one and the same time to show you how great is the folly of all such, and how much greater is the folly of those who, deeming themselves mightier than nature, think by sophistical arguments to bring that to pass which is beyond their power, and strive might and main to conform others to their own pattern, however little the nature of the latter may brook such treatment. Know then that there was in Pisa a judge, better endowed with mental than with physical vigor, by name Messer Ricciardo di Cinzica, who, being minded to take a wife, and thinking perhaps to satisfy her by the same resources which served him for his studies, was to be suited with none that had not both youth and beauty, qualities which he would rather have eschewed, if he had known how to give himself as good counsel as he gave to others. However, being very rich, he had his desire. Messer Lotto Gualandi gave him in marriage one of his daughters, Bartolomea by name, a maid as fair and fit for amorous dalliance as any in Pisa, though few maids be there that do not show as spotted lizards. The judge brought her home with all pomp and ceremony, and had a brave and lordly wedding. But in the essay which he made the very first night to serve her so as to consummate the marriage, he made a false move, and drew the game much to his own disadvantage. For next morning, his lean, withered, and scarce animate frame was only to be requickened by draughts of vernaxia, artificial restoratives, and the like remedies. So, taking a more sober estimate of his powers than he had been wont, the worthy judge began to give his wife lessons from a calendar, which might have served as a hornbook, and perhaps had been put together at Ravenna, too, inasmuch as, according to his showing, there was not a day in the year but was sacred, not to one saint only, but to many, in honor of whom for divers reasons it behoved men and women to abstain from carnal intercourse. Whereto he added fast days, ember days, vigils of apostles and other saints, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the whole of Lent, certain lunar mansions, and many other exceptions, arguing perchance that the practice of men with women abed should have its times of vacation no less than the administration of the law. In this method, which caused the Lady grievous dumps, he long persisted, hardly touching her once a month, and observing her closely, lest another should give her to no working days, as he had taught her holidays. Now it so befell that, one hot season, Messer Ricciardo thought he would like to visit a very beautiful estate which he had near Monte Nero, there to take the air and recreate himself for some days, and thither accordingly he went with his fair lady. While there, to amuse her, he arranged for a day's fishing. And so, he in one boat with the fishermen, and she in another with other ladies, they put out to watch the sport, which they found so delightsome, that almost before they knew where they were some miles out to sea. And while they were thus engrossed with the sport, a galliot of Paganino de Mare, a very famous corsair of those days, hove in sight and bore down upon the boats, and, for all the speed they made, came up with that in which were the ladies. and on sight of the fair Lady Paganino, regardless of all else, bore her off to his galliot before the very eyes of Messer Ricciardo, who was by this time ashore, and forthwith was gone. The chagrin of the judge, who was jealous of the very air, may readily be imagined. But 'twas to no purpose that, both at Pisa and elsewhere, he moaned and groaned over the wickedness of the corsairs, for he knew neither by whom his wife had been abducted, nor whither she had been taken. Paganino, meanwhile, deemed himself lucky to have gotten so beautiful a prize, and being unmarried, he was minded never to part with her, and addressed himself by soft words to soothe the sorrow which kept her in a flood of tears. Finding words of little avail, he at night passed them more readily that the calendar had slipped from his girdle, and all feasts and holidays from his mind to acts of love. And on this wise administered consolation so effective that before they were come to Monaco, she had completely forgotten the judge and his canons, and had begun to live with Paganino as merrily as might be. So he brought her to Monaco, where, besides the daily and nightly solace which he gave her, he honorably entreated her as his wife. Not long afterwards, Messer Ricciardo coming to know where his wife was, and being most ardently desirous to have her back, and thinking none but he would understand exactly what to do in the circumstances, determined to go and fetch her himself, being prepared to spend any sum of money that might be demanded by way of ransom. So he took ship, and being come to Monaco, he both saw her and was seen by her, which news she communicated to Paganino in the evening, and told him how she was minded to behave. Next morning Messer Ricciardo, encountering Paganino, made up to him, and soon assumed a very familiar and friendly air, while Paganino pretended not to know him, being on his guard to see what he would be at. So Messer Ricciardo, as soon as he deemed the time ripe, as best and most delicately he was able, disclosed to Paganino the business on which he had come, praying him to take whatever in the way of ransom he chose and restore him the lady. Paganino replied cheerily, "Right glad I am to see you here, sir, and briefly thus I answer you, true it is that I have here a young woman, whether she be your wife or another man's, I know not, for you are none of my acquaintance, nor is she, except for the short time that she has been with me. If, as you say, you are her husband, why, as you seem to me to be a pleasant gentleman, I will even take you to her, and I doubt not she will know you well. If she says that it is even as you say, and is minded to go with you, you shall give me just what you like by way of ransom, so pleasant have I found you. Otherwise, 'twill be churlish in you to think of taking her from me, who am a young man, and as fit to keep a woman as another, and moreover never knew any woman so agreeable." "My wife," said Ricciardo, "she is beyond all manner of doubt, as thou shalt see, for so soon as thou bringest me to her, she will throw her arms about my neck, wherefore as thou art minded, even so be it, ask no more." "Go we then," said Paganino, and forthwith they went into the house, and Paganino sent for the lady while they waited in one of the halls. By and by, she entered from one of the adjoining rooms all trim and tricked out, and advanced to the place where Paganino and Messer Ricciardo were standing, but never a word did she vouchsafe to her husband, any more than if he had been some stranger whom Paganino had brought into the house. Whereat the judge was mightily amazed, having expected to be greeted by her with the heartiest of cheer, and began to ruminate thus, "Perhaps I am so changed by the melancholy and prolonged heartache, to which I have been a prey since I lost her, that she does not recognize me." Wherefore he said, "Madam, cause enough have I to rue it that I took thee a-fishing, for never yet was known such grief as has been mine since I lost thee. And now it seems as if thou dost not recognize me, so scant of courtesy is thy greeting. Seest thou not that I am thy Messer Ricciardo, come hither prepared to pay whatever this gentleman, in whose house we are, may demand, that I may have thee back and take thee away with me, and he is so good as to surrender thee on my own terms." The lady turned to him with a slight smile and said, "Is it to me you speak, sir? Bethink you that you may have mistaken me for another, for I, for my part, do not remember ever to have seen you." "Nay," said Messer Ricciardo, "but bethink thee what thou say'st, scan me closely, and if thou wilt but search thy memory, thou wilt find that I am thy Ricciardo di Cinzica." "Your pardon, sir," answered the lady. "'Tis not, perhaps, as seemly for me, as you imagine, to gaze long upon you, but I have gazed long enough to know that I never saw you before." Messer Ricciardo supposed that she so spoke for fear of Paganino, in whose presence she durst not acknowledge that she knew him, So, after a while, he craved as a favor of Paganino that he might speak with her in a room alone. Which request Paganino granted, so only that he did not kiss her against her will. He then bade the lady go with Messer Ricciardo into a room apart, and hear what he had to say, and give him such answer as she deemed meet. So the lady and Messer Ricciardo went together into a room alone, and sate down, and Messer Ricciardo began on this wise. Ah, dear heart of me, sweet soul of me, hope of me, dost not recognize thy Ricciardo that loves thee better than himself? How comes it thus to pass? Am I then so changed? Ah, goodly eye of me, do but look on me a little. Whereat the lady burst into a laugh, and interrupting him, said, Rest assured that my memory is not so short, but that I know you for what you are, my husband, Messer Ricciardo di Cinzica. But far enough you showed yourself to be, while I was with you, from knowing me for what I was, young, lusty, lively. Which, had you been the wise man you would fain be reputed, you would not have ignored, nor by consequence that which, besides food and clothing, it behoves men to give young ladies, albeit for shame they demand it not, which in what sort you gave, you know. You should not have taken a wife if she was to be less to you than the study of the law, albeit 'twas never as a judge that I regarded you, but rather as a bellman of Encenia and saints' days, so well you knew them all, and fasts and vigils. And I tell you that, had you imposed the observance of as many saints' days on the laborers that till your lands as on yourself who had but my little plot to till, you would never have harvested a single grain of corn. God in his mercy, having regard unto my youth, has caused me to fall in with this gentleman, with whom I am much closeted in this room, where naught is known of feasts, such feasts, I mean, as you, more devoted to the service of God than to the service of ladies, were wont to observe in such profusion. Nor was this threshold ever crossed by Saturday or Friday or Vigil or Ember Days or Lent, that is so long. Rather here we are at work day and night, thrashing the wool, and well I know how featly it went when the matin bell last sounded. Wherefore with him I mean to stay, and to work while I am young, and postpone the observance of feasts and times of indulgence and fasts until I am old. So get you hence, and good luck go with you, but depart with what speed you may, and observe as many feasts as you like, so I be not with you. The pain with which Messer Ricciardo followed this outburst was more than he could bear, and when she had done, he exclaimed, Ah, sweet soul of me, what words are these that thou utterest? Hast thou no care for thy parents' honor, and thine own? Wilt thou remain here to be this man's harlot, and to live in mortal sin, rather than live with me at Pisa as my wife? Why, when he is tired of thee, he will cast thee out to thy most grievous dishonor. I will ever cherish thee, and ever will I nilly, thou wilt be the mistress of my house. Wouldst thou, to gratify this unbridled and unseemly passion, part at once with thy honor and with me, who love thee more dearly than my very life? Ah, cherished hope of me, say not so again, make up thy mind to come with me. As I now know thy bent, I will henceforth constrain myself to pleasure thee. Wherefore, sweet my treasure, think better of it, and come with me, who have never known a happy hour since thou wert reft from me. The lady answered, I expect not, nor is it possible, that another should be more tender of my honor than I am myself. Were my parents so, when they gave me to you? I trow not, nor mean I to be more tender of their honor now than they were then of mine. And if now I live in mortar sin, I will ever abide there until it be pestle sin. 3. Concern yourself no further on my account. Moreover, let me tell you that, whereas at Pisa 'twas as if I were your harlot, seeing that the planets in conjunction according to lunar mansion and geometric square intervened between you and me, here with Paganino I deem myself a wife. For he holds me in his arms all night long and hugs and bites me, and how he serves me, God be my witness. Ah, but you say you will constrain yourself to serve me. To what end? To do it on the third essay, and raise it by stroke of baton. I doubt not you are become a perfect knight, since last I saw you. Begone and constrain yourself to live, for here, methinks, your tenure is but precarious, so hectic and wasted is your appearance. Nay more, I tell you this that, should Paganino desert me, which he does not seem disposed to do so long as I am willing to stay with him, never will I return to your house, where for one while I stayed to my most grievous loss and prejudice, but will seek my commodity elsewhere, than with one from whose whole body I could not wring a single cupful of sap. So again, I tell you that here is neither feast nor vigil, wherefore here I mean to abide, and you get you gone, in God's name with what speed you may, lest I raise the cry that you threaten to violate me. Messer Ricciardo felt himself hard-bested, but he could not but recognize that, worn out as he was, he had been foolish to take a young wife. So sad and woebegone he quitted the room, and after expending on Paganino a wealth of words which signified nothing, he at last gave up his bootless enterprise, and leaving the lady to her own devices, returned to Pisa. Where for very grief he lapsed into such utter imbecility that, when he was met by any with greeting or question in the street, he made no other answer than the evil hole brooks no holiday, and soon afterwards died. Which when Paganino learned, being well assured of the love the lady bore him, he made her his lawful wife. And so, keeping neither feast nor vigil nor Lent, they worked as hard as their legs permitted and had a good time. Wherefore, dear my ladies, I am of opinion that Messer Bernabo in his altercation with Ambrogiulo rode the goat downhill. 4. 1. A strong white wine. 2. The saying went, that owing to the multitude of churches at Ravenna, every day was there a saint's day. 3. A poor Jew de Mose, mortio mortar, being substituted for mortal. 4. I.e. argued preposterously, the goat being the last animal to carry a rider comfortably downhill. This story provoked so much laughter that the jaws of everyone in the company ached, and all the ladies by common consent acknowledged that Dionio was right and pronounced Bernabo a blockhead. But when the story was ended and the laughter had subsided, the queen, observing that the hour was now late, and that with the completion of the day's storytelling the end of her sovereignty was come, followed the example of her predecessor, and took off her wreath and set it on Nephal's brow, saying with gladsome mien, "Now, dear gossip, thine be the sovereignty of this little people." And so she resumed her seat. Nephal colored somewhat to receive such honor, showing of aspect even as the fresh-blown rose of April or May in the radiance of the dawn, her eyes rather downcast, and glowing with love's fire like the morning star. But when the respectful murmur, by which the rest of the company gave blithe token of the favor in which they held their queen, was hushed, and her courage revived, she raised herself somewhat more in her seat than she was wont, and thus spoke. "As so it is that I am your queen, I purpose not to depart from the usage observed by my predecessors, whose rule has commanded not only your obedience but your approbation. I will therefore in few words explain to you the course which, if it commend itself to your wisdom, we will follow. Tomorrow, is Friday, and the next day Saturday, days which most folk find somewhat wearisome by reason of the viands which are then customary, to say nothing of the reverence in which Friday is meet to be held, seeing that 'twas on that day that he who died for us bore his passion. Wherefore, 'twould be in my judgment both right and very seemly, if in honor of God, we then bade storytelling give place to prayer. On Saturday ladies are wont to wash the head, and rid their persons of whatever of dust or other soilure they may have gathered by the labors of the past week. Not a few, likewise, are wont to practice abstinence for devotion to the Virgin Mother of the Son of God, and to honor the approaching Sunday by an entire surcease from work. Wherefore, as we cannot then completely carry out our plan of life, we shall, I think, do well to intermit our storytelling on that day also. We shall then have been here 4 days, and lest we should be surprised by newcomers, I deem it expedient that we shift our quarters, and I have already taken thought for our next place of sojourn. Where, being arrived on Sunday, we will assemble after our sleep. And whereas today our discourse has had an ample field to range in, I propose, both because you will thereby have more time for thought, and it will be best to set some limits to the license of our storytelling, that of the many diversities of fortune's handiwork we make one our theme, whereof I have also made choice, to wit, the luck of such as have painfully acquired some much coveted thing, or having lost, have recovered it. Whereon let each meditate some matter, which to tell may be profitable or at least delectable to the company, saving always Dionio's privilege." All applauded the queen's speech and plan, to which, therefore, it was decided to give effect. Thereupon the queen called her seneschal, told him where to place the tables that evening, and then explained to him all that he had to do during the time of her sovereignty. This done, she rose with her train, and gave leave to all to take their pleasure as to each might seem best. So the ladies and the men hied them away to a little garden, where they diverted themselves a while. Then supper time being come, they supped with all gay and festal cheer. When they were risen from the table, Emilia, at the queen's command, led the dance, while Pampania, the other ladies responding, sang the ensuing song. Shall any lady sing? If I not sing, I to whom love did full contentment bring. Come hither, love, thou cause of all my joy, of all my hope, and all its sequel blessed. And with me tune the lay, no more to sighs and bitter past annoy, that now but serve to lend thy bliss more zest. But to that fire's clear ray, wherewith enwrapped I blithely live and gay, thee as my God for ever worshipping. 'Twas thou, O love, didst set before mine eyes, when first thy fire my soul did penetrate, a youth to be my fear, so fair, so fit for deeds of high emprise, that ne'er another shall be found more great, nay, nor, I ween, his peer. Such flame he kindled that my heart's full cheer I now pour out in chant with thee, my king. And that wherein I most delight is this, that as I love him, so he loveth me, so thank thee, love, I must. For whatsoe'er this world can yield of bliss is mine, and in the next at peace, to be I hope through that full trust I place in him. And thou, O God, that dost it see, wilt grant of joy thy plenishing. Some other songs and dances followed, to the accompaniment of divers sorts of music. After which, the queen deeming it time to go to rest, all, following in the wake of the torches, sought their several chambers. The next 2 days they devoted to the duties to which the queen had adverted, looking forward to the Sunday with eager expectancy. Endeth here the 2nd day of the Decameron, beginneth the 3rd, in which under the rule of Nephil, discourse is had of the fortune of such as have painfully acquired some much coveted thing, or, having lost, have recovered it. The dawn of Sunday was already changing from vermilion to orange, as the sun hasted to the horizon, when the queen rose and roused all the company. The seneschal had early sent forward to their next place of sojourn ample store of things meet with folk to make all things ready, and now seeing the queen on the road, and the decampment, as it were, begun, he hastily completed the equipment of the baggage train, and set off therewith, attended by the rest of the servants, in rear of the ladies and gentlemen. So to the chant of, perhaps, a score of nightingales and other birds, the queen, her ladies and the 3 young men trooping beside or after her, paced leisurely westward by a path little frequented and overgrown with herbage and flowers, which, as they caught the sunlight, began one and all to unfold their petals. So fared she on with her train, while the quirk and the jest and the laugh passed from mouth to mouth, nor had they completed more than 2,000 paces when, well before half-tierce, they arrived at a palace most fair and sumptuous, which stood out somewhat from the plain, being situate upon a low eminence. On entering, they first traversed its great halls and dainty chambers furnished throughout with all brave and meet appointments, and finding all most commendable, they reputed its lord a magnifico. Then descending, they surveyed its spacious and cheerful court, its vaults of excellent wines and copious springs of most cool water, and found it still more commendable. After which, being fain of rest, they sat them down in a gallery which commanded the court, and was close embosked with leafage and such flowers as the season afforded. And thither the discreet seneschal brought comfits and wines most choice and excellent, wherewith they were refreshed. Whereupon they hied them to a walled garden adjoining the palace, which, the gate being opened, they entered, and wonderstruck by the beauty of the whole, passed on to examine more attentively the several parts. It was bordered and traversed in many parts by alleys, each very wide and straight as an arrow, and roofed in with trellis of vines, which gave good promise of bearing clusters that year, and, being all in flower, dispersed such fragrance throughout the garden as blended with that exhaled by many another plant that grew therein, made the garden seem redolent of all the spices that ever grew in the east. The sides of the alleys were all, as it were, walled in with roses white and red and jasmine, insomuch that there was no part of the garden but one might walk there not merely in the morning, but at high noon in grateful shade and fragrance, completely screened from the sun. As for the plants that were in the garden, 'twere long to enumerate them, to specify their sorts, to describe the order of their arrangement. Enough, in brief, that there was abundance of every rarer species that our climate allows. In the middle of the garden, a thing not less but much more to be commended than aught else, was a lawn of the finest turf, and so green that it seemed almost black, pranked with flowers of perhaps 1,000 sorts, and girt about with the richest living verdure of orange trees and cedars, which showed not only flowers but fruits both new and old, and were no less grateful to the smell by their fragrance than to the eye by their shade. In the middle of the lawn was a basin of whitest marble, graven with marvelous art. In the center, whereof whether the spring were natural or artificial, I know not rose a column supporting a figure which sent forth a jet of water of such volume, and to such an altitude that it fell, not without a delicious plash, into the basin in quantity amply sufficient to turn a mill wheel. The overflow was carried away from the lawn by a hidden conduit, and then, re-emerging, was distributed through tiny channels, very fair and cunningly contrived, in such sort as to flow round the entire lawn, and by similar derivative channels to penetrate almost every part of the fair garden, until, reuniting at a certain point, it issued thence, and, clear as crystal, slid down towards the plain, turning by the way 2 mill wheels with extreme velocity to the no small profit of the Lord. The aspect of this garden, its fair order, the plants and the fountain and the rivulets that flowed from it, so charmed the ladies and the 3 young men that with one accord they affirmed that they knew not how it could receive any accession of beauty, or what other form could be given to paradise, if it were to be planted on earth. So, excellently well pleased, they roved about it, plucking sprays from the trees and weaving them into the fairest of garlands, while songsters of, perhaps, a score of different sorts warbled as if in mutual emulation, when suddenly a sight as fair and delightsome as novel, which, engrossed by the other beauties of the place, they had hitherto overlooked, met their eyes. For the garden, they now saw, was peopled with a host of living creatures, fair and of, perhaps, 100 sorts, and they pointed out to one another how here emerged a canaille, or there scampered a hare, or couched a goat, or grazed a fawn, or many another harmless, all but domesticated, creature roved carelessly seeking his pleasure at his own sweet will. All which served immensely to reinforce their already abundant delight. At length, however, they had enough of wandering about the garden and observing this thing and that. Wherefore they repaired to the beautiful fountain, around which were ranged the tables, and there, after they had sung 6 songs and trod some measures, they sat them down, at the Queen's command, to breakfast, which was served with all celerity and in fair and orderly manner, the viands being both good and delicate. Whereby their spirits rose, and up they got, and betook themselves again to music and song and dance, and so sped the hours, until, as the heat increased, the Queen deemed it time that whoso was so minded should go to sleep. Some there were that did so. Others were too charmed by the beauty of the place to think of leaving it, but tarried there, and, while the rest slept, amused themselves with reading romances or playing at chess or dice. However, after none, there was a general levee, and, with faces laved and refreshed with cold water, they gathered by the Queen's command upon the lawn, and, having sat them down in their wonted order by the fountain, waited for the storytelling to begin upon the theme assigned by the Queen. With this duty the Queen first charged Philostrato, who began on this wise. 1 I. Midway between prime and tierce, about 7:30 a.m. Novel I. Mazzetto de Lamporecchio feigns to be dumb, and obtains a gardener's place at a convent of women, who with one accord make haste to lie with him. Fairest ladies, not a few there are both of men and of women, who are so foolish as blindly to believe that, so soon as a young woman has been veiled in white and cowled in black, she ceases to be a woman and is no more subject to the cravings proper to her sex, than if, in assuming the garb and profession of a nun, she had put on the nature of a stone. And if, perchance, they hear of aught that is counter to this their faith, they are no less vehement in their censure than if some most heinous and unnatural crime had been committed, neither bethinking them of themselves, whom unrestricted liberty avails not to satisfy, nor making due allowance for the prepotent forces of idleness and solitude. And likewise not a few there are that blindly believe that, what with the hoe and the spade and coarse fare and hardship, the carnal propensities are utterly eradicated from the tillers of the soil, and therewith all nimbleness of wit and understanding. But how gross is the error of such as so suppose! I, on whom the Queen has laid her commands, am minded, without deviating from the theme prescribed by her, to make manifest to you by a little story. In this very countryside of ours, there was and yet is a convent of women of great repute, for sanctity name it I will not, lest I should in some measure diminish its repute, the nuns being at the time of which I speak but 9 in number, including the abbess and all young women. Their very beautiful garden was in charge of a foolish fellow, who, not being content with his wage, squared accounts with their steward and hied him back to Lamporecchio, whence he came. Among others who welcomed him home was a young husbandman, Mazzetto by name, a stout and hearty fellow, and handsome for a contadino, who asked him where he had been so long. Nudo, as our good friend was called, told him. Mazzetto then asked how he had been employed at the convent, and Nudo answered, I kept their large and beautiful garden in good trim, and besides, I sometimes went to the wood to fetch the faggots, I drew water, and did some other trifling services. But the ladies gave so little wage that it scarce kept me in shoes. And moreover they are all young, and, I think, they are one and all possessed of the devil, for 'tis impossible to do anything to their mind. Indeed, when I would be at work in the kitchen garden, put this here, would say one, put that here, would say another, and a third would snatch the hoe from my hand, and say, that is not as it should be. And so they would worry me until I would give up working and go out of the garden. So that, what with this thing and that, I was minded to stay there no more, and so I am come hither. The steward asked me before I left to send him anyone whom on my return I might find fit for the work, and I promised. But God bless his loins, I shall be at no pains to find out and send him anyone. As Nudo thus ran on, Mazzetto was seized by such a desire to be with these nuns that he quite pined, as he gathered from what Nudo said that his desire might be gratified. And as that could not be, if he said nothing to Nudo, he remarked, 'Twas well done of thee to come hither. A man to live with women. He might as well live with so many devils. 6 times out of 7, they know not themselves what they want. There the conversation ended, but Mazzetto began to cast about how he should proceed to get permission to live with them. He knew that he was quite competent for the services of which Nudo spoke, and had therefore no fear of failing on that score. But he doubted he should not be received, because he was too young and well-favored. So after much pondering, he fell into the following train of thought. The place is a long way off, and no one there knows me. If I make believe that I am dumb, doubtless I shall be admitted. Whereupon he made his mind up, laid a hatchet across his shoulder, and saying not a word to any of his destination, set forth, intending to present himself at the convent in the character of a destitute man. Arrived there, he had no sooner entered than he chanced to encounter the steward in the courtyard, and making signs to him as dumb folk do, he let him know that of his charity he craved something to eat, and that, if need were, he would split firewood. The steward promptly gave him to eat, and then set before him some logs which Nudo had not been able to split, all which Mazzetto, who was very strong, split in a very short time. The steward, having occasion to go to the wood, took him with him, and there set him at work on the lopping. Which done, he placed the ass in front of him, and by signs made him understand that he was to take the loppings back to the convent. This he did so well, that the steward kept him for some days to do 1 or 2 odd jobs. Whereby it so befell that one day the abbess saw him, and asked the steward who he was. Madam, replied the steward, 'tis a poor deaf-mute that came here a day or 2 ago craving alms, so I have treated him kindly, and have let him make himself useful in many ways. If he knew how to do the work of the kitchen garden and would stay with us, I doubt not we should be well served, for we have need of him, and he is strong, and would be able for whatever he might turn his hand to. Besides which you would have no cause to be apprehensive lest he should be cracking his jokes with your young women. As I trust in God, said the abbess, thou say'st sooth, find out if he can do the garden work, and if he can, do all thou canst to keep him with us. Give him a pair of shoes, an old hood, and speak him well, make much of him, and let him be well fed. All which the steward promised to do. Mazzetto, meanwhile, was close at hand, making as if he were sweeping the courtyard, and heard all that passed between the abbess and the steward, whereat he gleefully communed with himself on this wise. Put me once within there, and you will see that I will do the work of the kitchen garden as it never was done before. So the steward set him to work in the kitchen garden, and finding that he knew his business excellently well, made signs to him to know whether he would stay, and he made answer by signs that he was ready to do whatever the steward wished. The steward then signified that he was engaged, told him to take charge of the kitchen garden, and showed him what he had to do there. Then, having other matters to attend to, he went away and left him there. Now, as Mazzetto worked there day by day, the nuns began to tease him and make him their butt, as it commonly happens that folk serve the dumb, and used bad language to him, the worst they could think of, supposing that he could not understand them, all which passed scarce heeded by the abbess, who perhaps deemed him as destitute of virility as of speech. Now it so befell that after a hard day's work he was taking a little rest, when two young nuns, who were walking in the garden, approached the spot where he lay and stopped to look at him, while he pretended to be asleep. And so the bolder of the two said to the other, "If I thought thou wouldst keep the secret, I would tell thee what I have sometimes meditated, and which thou perhaps mightest also find agreeable." The other replied, "Speak thy mind freely, and be sure that I will never tell a soul." Whereupon the bold one began, "I know not if thou hast ever considered how close we are kept here, and that within these precincts dare never enter any man, unless it be the old steward or this mute. And I have often heard from ladies that have come hither, that all the other sweets that the world has to offer signify not a jot in comparison of the pleasure that a woman has in connection with a man. Whereof I have more than once been minded to make experiment with this mute, no other man being available. Nor, indeed, could one find any man in the whole world so meet therefore, seeing that he could not blab if he would. Thou seest that he is but a dull, clownish lad, whose size has increased out of all proportion to his sense, wherefore I would fain hear what thou hast to say to it." "Alas," said the other, "what is't thou sayst? Knowest thou not that we have vowed our virginity to God?" "Oh," rejoined the first, "think but how many vows are made to him all day long, and never one performed, and so, for our vow, let him find another or others to perform it." "But," said her companion, "suppose that we conceived, how then?" "Nay, but," protested the first, "thou goest about to imagine evil before it befalls thee. Time enough to think of that when it comes to pass. There will be 1,000 ways to prevent its ever being known, so only we do not publish it ourselves." Thus reassured, the other was now the more eager of the two to test the quality of the male human animal. "Well then," she said, "how shall we go about it?" And was answered, "Thou seest tease past none. I make no doubt but all these sisters are asleep, except ourselves. Search we through the kitchen garden, to see if there be any there, and if there be none, we have but to take him by the hand and lead him hither to the hut where he takes shelter from the rain, and then one shall mount guard while the other has him with her inside. He is such a simpleton that he will do just whatever we bid him." No word of this conversation escaped Mazzetto, who, being disposed to obey, hoped for nothing so much as that one of them should take him by the hand. They meanwhile looked carefully all about them, and satisfied themselves that they were secure from observation. Then she that had broached the subject came close up to Mazzetto and shook him, whereupon he started to his feet. So she took him by the hand with a blandishing air, to which he replied with some clownish grins. And then she led him into the hut, where he needed no pressing to do what she desired of him. Which done, she changed places with the other, as loyal comradeship required, and Mazzetto, still keeping up the pretense of simplicity, did their pleasure. Wherefore, before they left, each must needs make another assay of the mute's powers of writing. And afterwards, talking the matter over many times, they agreed that it was in truth not less but even more delightful than they had been given to understand. And so, as they found convenient opportunity, they continued to go and disport themselves with the mute. Now it so chanced that one of their gossips, looking out of the window of her cell, saw what they did, and imparted it to 2 others. The 3 held counsel together whether they should not denounce the offenders to the abbess, but soon changed their mind, and came to an understanding with them, whereby they became partners in Mazzetto. And in course of time, by divers chances, the remaining 3 nuns also entered the partnership. Last of all the abbess, still witting naught of these doings, happened one very hot day, as she walked by herself through the garden, to find Mazzetto, who now rode so much by night that he could stand very little fatigue by day, stretched at full length asleep under the shade of an almond tree. his person quite exposed in front by reason that the wind had disarranged his clothes. Which the lady observing, and knowing that she was alone, fell a prey to the same appetite to which her nuns had yielded. She aroused Mazzetto, and took him with her to her chamber, where, for some days, though the nuns loudly complained that the gardener no longer came to work in the kitchen garden, she kept him, tasting and retasting the sweetness of that indulgence which she was wont to be the first to censure in others. And when at last she had sent him back from her chamber to his room, she must needs send for him again and again, and made such exorbitant demands upon him, that Mazzetto, not being able to satisfy so many women, bethought him that his part of mute, should he persist in it, might entail disastrous consequences. So one night when he was with the abbess, he cut the tongue string and thus broke silence. "Madam, I have understood that a cock may very well serve 10 hens, but that 10 men are sorely tasked to satisfy a single woman, and here am I expected to serve 9, a burden quite beyond my power to bear. Nay, by what I have already undergone I am now so reduced that my strength is quite spent, wherefore either bid me Godspeed, or find some means to make matters tolerable." Wonderstruck to hear the supposed mute thus speak, the lady exclaimed, "What means this? I took thee to be dumb." "And in sooth, madam, so was I," said Mazzetto, "not indeed from my birth, but through an illness which took from me the power of speech, which only this very night have I recovered, and so I praise God with all my heart." The lady believed him, and asked him what he meant by saying that he had 9 to serve. Mazzetto told her how things stood, whereby she perceived that of all her nuns there was not any but was much wiser than she. And lest, if Mazzetto were sent away, he should give the convent a bad name, she discreetly determined to arrange matters with the nuns in such sort that he might remain there. So the steward having died within the last few days, she assembled all the nuns. And their and her own past errors being fully avowed, they by common consent, and with Mazzetto's concurrence, resolved that the neighbors should be given to understand that by their prayers and the merits of their patron saint, Mazzetto, long mute, had recovered the power of speech. After which they made him steward, and so ordered matters among themselves that he was able to endure the burden of their service. In the course of which, though he procreated not a few little monastics, yet 'twas all managed so discreetly that no breath of scandal stirred, until after the abbess's death, by which time Mazzetto was advanced in years and minded to return home with the wealth that he had gotten, which he was suffered to do as soon as he made his desire known. And so Mazzetto, who had left Lamporecchio with a hatchet on his shoulder, returned thither in his old age rich and a father, having by the wisdom with which he employed his youth, spared himself the pains and expense of rearing children, and averring that such was the measure that Christ meted out to the man that set horns on his cap. Novel 2. A groom lies with the wife of King Agilulf, who learns the fact, keeps his own counsel, finds out the groom and shears him. The shorn shears all his fellows, and so comes safe out of the scrape. Philostrato's story, which the ladies had received now with blushes now with laughter, being ended, the queen bade Pampinea follow suit. Which behest Pampinea smilingly obeyed, and thus began. Some there are whose indiscretion is such that they must needs evince that they are fully cognizant of that which it were best they should not know, and censuring the covert misdeeds of others, augment beyond measure the disgrace which they would fain diminish. The truth whereof, fair ladies, I mean to show you in the contrary case, wherein appears the astuteness of one that held, perhaps, an even lower place than would have been Mazzetto's in the esteem of a doughty king. Agilulf, king of the Lombards, who like his predecessors made the city of Pavia in Lombardy the seat of his government, took to wife Theodelinda, the widow of Othari, likewise king of the Lombards, a lady very fair, wise, and virtuous, but who was unfortunate in her lover. For while the Lombards prospered in peace under the wise and firm rule of King Agilulf, it so befell that one of the queen's grooms, a man born to very low estate, but in native worth far above his mean office, and moreover not a whit less tall and goodly of person than the king, became inordinately enamored of her. And as, for all his base condition, he had sense enough to recognize that his love was in the last degree presumptuous, he disclosed it to none, nay, he did not even venture to tell her the tale by the mute eloquence of his eyes. And albeit he lived without hope that he should ever be able to win her favor, Yet he inwardly gloried that he had fixed his affections in so high a place. And being all aflame with passion, he showed himself zealous beyond any of his comrades to do whatever he thought was likely to please the queen. Whereby it came about that, when the queen had to take horse, she would mount the palfrey that he groomed rather than any other. And when she did so, he deemed himself most highly favored and never quitted her stirrup, esteeming himself happy if he might but touch her clothes. But as 'tis frequently observed that love waxes as hope wanes, so was it with this poor groom, insomuch that the burden of this great hidden passion, alleviated by no hope, was most grievous to bear. And from time to time, not being able to shake it off, he purposed to die. And meditating on the mode, he was minded that it should be of a kind to make it manifest that he died for the love which he had borne and bore to the queen, and also to afford him an opportunity of trying his fortune, whether his desire might in whole or in part be gratified. He had no thought of speaking to the queen, nor yet of declaring his love to her by letter, for he knew that 'twould be vain either to speak or to write. But he resolved to try to devise some means whereby he might lie with the queen, which end might in no other way be compassed than by contriving to get access to her in her bedroom, which could only be by passing himself off as the king, who, as he knew, did not always lie with her. Wherefore, that he might observe the carriage and dress of the king as he passed to her room, he contrived to conceal himself for several nights in a great hall of the king's palace, which separated the king's room from that of the queen. And on one of these nights he saw the king issue from his room, wrapped in a great mantle, with a lighted torch in one hand and a wand in the other, and cross the hall, and, saying nothing, tap the door of the queen's room with the wand once or twice. Whereupon the door was at once opened, and the torch taken from his hand. Having observed the king thus go and return, and being bent on doing likewise, he found means to come by a mantle like that which he had seen the king wear, and also a torch and a wand. He then took a warm bath, and having thoroughly cleansed himself, that the smell of the foul straw might not offend the lady, or discover to her the deceit, he in this guise concealed himself as he was wont in the great hall. He waited only until all were asleep, and then, deeming the time come to accomplish his purpose, or by his presumption clear a way to the death which he coveted, he struck a light with the flint and steel which he had brought with him. And having kindled his torch and wrapped himself close in his mantle, he went to the door of the queen's room and tapped on it twice with his wand. The door was opened by a very drowsy chambermaid, who took the torch and put it out of sight. Whereupon, without a word, he passed within the curtain, laid aside the mantle, and got into the bed where the queen lay asleep. Then, taking her in his arms and straining her to him with ardor, making as if he were moody, because he knew that, when the king was in such a frame, he would never hear aught, in such wise, without word said either on his part or on hers, he had more than once carnal cognizance of the queen. Loath indeed was he to leave her, but fearing lest by too long tarrying his achieved delight might be converted into woe, he rose, resumed the mantle and the light, and leaving the room without a word, returned with all speed to his bed. He was hardly there when the king got up and entered the queen's room, whereat she wondered not a little, but, reassured by the gladsome greeting which he gave her as he got into bed, she said, "My lord, what a surprise is this tonight! 'Twas but now you left me after an unwonted measure of enjoyment, and do you now return so soon? Consider what you do." From these words, the king at once inferred that the queen had been deceived by someone that had counterfeited his person and carriage, but at the same time, bethinking himself that, as neither the queen nor any other had detected the cheat, 'twas best to leave her in ignorance, he wisely kept silence. Which many a fool would not have done, but would have said, "Nay, 'twas not I that was here. Who was it that was here? How came it to pass? Who came hither?" Whereby in the sequel he might have caused the lady needless chagrin, and given her occasion to desire another such experience as she had had, and so have brought disgrace upon himself by uttering that, from which, unuttered, no shame could have resulted. Wherefore, betraying little either by his mien or by his words of the disquietude which he felt, the king replied, "Madam, seem I such to you that you cannot suppose that I should have been with you once and returned to you immediately afterwards?" "Nay, not so, my lord," returned the lady, "but none the less I pray you to look to your health." Then said the king, "And I am minded to take your advice, wherefore, without giving you further trouble, I will leave you." So, angered and incensed beyond measure by the trick which, he saw, had been played upon him, he resumed his mantle and quitted the room with the intention of privily detecting the offender, deeming that he must belong to the palace, and that, whoever he might be, he could not have quitted it. So, taking with him a small lantern which showed only a glimmer of light, he went into the dormitory which was over the palace stables and was of great length, insomuch that well-nigh all the men servants slept there in divers beds, and arguing that, by whomsoever that of which the queen spoke was done, his heart and pulse could not after such a strain as yet have ceased to throb, he began cautiously with one of the head grooms, and so went from bed to bed, feeling at the heart of each man to see if it was thumping. All were asleep, save only he that had been with the queen, who, seeing the king come, and guessing what he sought to discover, began to be mightily afraid, insomuch that to the agitation which his late exertion had communicated to his heart, terror now added one yet more violent, nor did he doubt that, should the king perceive it, he would kill him. Divers alternatives of action thronged his mind, but at last, observing that the king was unarmed, he resolved to make as if he were asleep, and wait to see what the king would do. So, having tried many and found none that he deemed the culprit, the king came at last to the culprit himself, and marking the thumping of his heart, said to himself, "This is he." But being minded to afford no clue to his ulterior purpose, he did no more than with a pair of scissors which he had brought with him shear away on one side of the man's head a portion of his locks, which, as was then the fashion, he wore very long, that by this token he might recognize him on the morrow, and having so done, he departed and returned to his room. The groom, who was fully sensible of what the king had done, and being a shrewd fellow understood very well to what end he was so marked, got up without a moment's delay. And, having found a pair of scissors for, as it chanced, there were several pairs there belonging to the stables for use in grooming the horse, he went quietly through the dormitory, and in like manner sheared the locks of each of the sleepers just above the ear, which done without disturbing any, he went back to bed. On the morrow, as soon as the king was risen, and before the gates of the palace were opened, he summoned all his men servants to his presence, and as they stood bareheaded before him, scanned them closely to see whether the one whom he had sheared was there. And observing with surprise that the more part of them were all sheared in the same manner, said to himself, "Of a surety this fellow, whom I go about to detect, evinces, for all his base condition, a high degree of sense." Then, recognizing that he could not compass his end without causing a bruit, and not being minded to brave so great a dishonor in order to be avenged upon so petty an offender, he was content by a single word of admonition to show him that his offense had not escaped notice. Wherefore, turning to them all, he said, "He that did it, let him do it no more, and get you hence in God's peace." Another would have put them to the strappado, the question, the torture, and thereby have brought to light that which one should rather be sedulous to cloak, and having so brought it to light, would, however complete the retribution which he exacted, have not lessened but vastly augmented his disgrace, and sullied the fair fame of his lady. Those who heard the king's parting admonition wondered, and made much question with one another, what the king might have meant to convey by it. But 'twas understood by none but him to whom it referred, who was discreet enough never to reveal the secret as long as the king lived, or again to stake his life on such a venture.